Now I've got a pair of crimp plug pliers here which do this job well for me, and I'm going to use those. So let me have a look at this. That should be pretty much symmetrical both. There's no up or down on this case. So I'm wiping some graphite grease on the inside. And I've got the spring here. That's got a little tab sticking up at one end. That needs to lodge into a little tiny notch in the central part of this clutch mechanism. Like that. Then I've got to compress that spring, so I'm lightly holding that with my crimp lug pliers, which have got nice curved jaws. Do that again because I'm so busy talking. I let the flame and pressure off the pliers and it dropped out. And I'm just rotate this and that pulls that spring in. Then I can drop the clutch over the top, let it go, and there we have our clutch assembly. Now the clutch assembly moves smoother in one direction than the other, and it only needs to move smoothly in one direction. So that's fine. Apply a little bit of synthetic grease to the centre where it runs over the bush on the advanced shaft. That can drop into place. I'll just rotate that till it engages with the film take-up spool. That's it. That's good. We have our guide bush with the gear on it here that needs to go on next. So I usually lubricate the gear on here by just taking a good sized glob of grease and pressing that in with my thumb, and the pressure just pushes that grease in. Run a smear around the inside surface there. And we'll drop this in, check that it's seated, check that the gear engages. I'm rolling the film take-up spool with my thumb. That looks good. So, you have a plain screw at this face. Run that down loosely, and here we have a bush. Now that's countersunk on one side. You want the plain side up, not the countersunk side. If you have the counterside sunk side up, you will end up with trouble. So the plain side up, put that little ratchet pawl in place, get the screw down through the bush, there we have it. I'm just checking that that ratchet pawl moves smoothly, and it does. Now I've got to get the spring on that ratchet pawl. In this case the spring's a little bit oddly shaped. Someone's been playing with it, but it should function fine, so I'm not going to try and improve it. Get that seated on the screw. There's a groove around that screw that the spring should run in. Make sure that's hooked in there. That's tucked in, and that the little pawl is sprung loaded. And it is. That spring's sitting oddly. No, that's fine. Right, well these two screws, I'm not doing them up tight yet because you need a little bit of extra clearance in some cases to get the sprocket shaft through. So we're not doing that first anyway. Let's just make sure that springs this bit. Yeah, that's all right. Just making sure that spring wasn't sticking up where it could get into trouble. We have this this piece, which I'm just lubricating underneath and that outer edge and in the centre. I'll rotate that into position anti-clockwise so that the ratchet pull falls into place. That looks good. This spring here is, I just give it a little wipe with grease, just a fine wipe. It doesn't need to be greasy, it's just to protect it against rust. Being steel, it's prone to rust. This piece of the mechanism goes on next. Now there's a chamfer on these two opposing faces here. The chamfer should be up, the plain side should be down. Here's the drive dog that drives that piece. There's a thin washer. Then we have the gear. Then we have the retaining screw. All of these parts are a little bit scarred up looking. I'm not sure what's being done to them. That's it, that's done up tight. So that's their film advance shaft all fitted into place. Next I want to put the catch in here for the rewind button catch needs to go in place, and then once we've got that done, then I can put the sprocket shaft and all in place and we shall be good to go. Alright, let's start with this catch. This is the rewind button catch, which holds the rewind button in the up position until you move the film advance again. Otherwise you'd be having to hold the rewind button through the whole operation of winding the film back into the cassette, which is something you have to do with some cameras and it's very tedious. That's good. So we need its return spring, and in keeping with most other things in this camera, someone has been adjusting the spring to presumably to make it a shape that pleases them more. I don't think it'll do us any harm. So I'll get that screw in. That's a shouldered screw, so the screw goes down through the spring and through the lever. That's all good. Now I need to hook that spring into place. I'll get it done quickly before my video camera battery decides it's had enough and stops recording. Oh, that's interesting. That spring caught there. See if I can get that hooked over correctly. Certainly doesn't want to go. That's better. Okay, so that spring's in place, that's all good. And I'm going to stop now and change this battery before my camera decides to do the job for me. Okay, fresh battery, good to go. So, our sprocket shaft here, the sprocket, one end has got a slot through it. It's this, that goes up. We'll fit that into place in the body. I'll take the sprocket shaft itself, run a smear of grease on the shaft at both ends where it's going to run through the body. I'll put a tiny smear on the gear itself at the top. Doesn't need much there, it's not doing much work. And drop this into place. Yeah, that's gone in. So holding some pressure on the top of that with my finger, I can pull back the lock lever at the bottom there, the back rewind button catch, and then if I revolve the take-up spool slightly, it just engages and moves over. So now that gear there is engaged at the top. I'm just rotating my take-up spool to bring the screw hole in the shaft where I can see it. And I can get that screw in there. That screw drives the sprocket shaft, or the sprocket shaft drives the sprockets with that screw. So that's engaged, that's all good. We need our rewind button, its spring and its washer. And unusually I've even got the tools on hand. Excuse me. I'll put a smear of grease into the spring, assemble the spring to the button, put the washer on there, holding my finger on the top of the shaft here so that it doesn't get away. Just screw that in to the end of the sprocket shaft. Check that it moves correctly. It does, it's not trapped or anything. Now holding my thumb on the sprocket here, I can do up the knob at the bottom, the button. Check that latch is down in position, and it does. Check that if I pull back the catch, it drops back out, and it does. That's good. So that's all in place. And we're just about ready to put the base plate on the camera and the film advance lever. So I'll pop this to one side for a minute because I've just looked at the film advance lever and realised that it's just a dirty, filthy mess at the moment. I haven't actually cleaned this. And worse than that, its little rubber buffer pad at the back here is actually gone. So I'll clean that up. I'll come back when that's clean. And then we'll tension up the film advance one turn. Put a cover plate on here. I've got to put the spring in for the capping plate. Put the cover plate on there. I've got a temporary that I use while I'm working. And then we'll put the lever in place. And that'll be the bottom of the camera until we're ready to finally close up the camera at the end of the job after that. So first I've got to clean this lever. Alright, so I've got that in place. Now I need to tension the film advance by one turn. So what I'm going to do is press in the lock lever, swing it to one side so that it's not fouling things. Hold back the release lever, rotate my advance one full turn clockwise, drop the lock lever back into position. Now the film advance is all tensioned up correctly. I've got a spring here for our capping plate, so I'll drop that into position and down that hole. I'll put this temporary cover on, and I've got 3 screws to hold that in place because 3 is enough. And I've got to be careful not to press the lock lever in particular at this stage, otherwise I'll lose the tension on there and I'll have to start again. That screw is a bit mutilated looking. Alright, that's good. I can fit my advance lever. It's got 3 screws, but typically 2 is enough while you're working on the camera. I'll put the 3rd one in because it saves me having to find it later from wherever I've hidden it. Alright, so our film advance, the lower part is all working smoothly. If I hold my finger on the lock lever, I've got to hold down the lock lever, press the release here, that mechanism is nice and smooth, it's nice and positive. It returns to the rest position smoothly. Our 2 screws at the top of the camera here now, I'm going to tighten those. I don't think we need to revisit that. And next, what do we got next? Oh, I suppose we can put the cocking rack in next. Okay. So we have a bush that goes on here. It looks a bit like the black washers that go on the front of the camera, but it's a much thicker bush. Can I put the chrome trim in place at this stage? I think so. Let's do that. Got my chrome trim plate here somewhere. We'll put that on the body. That looks better. That's good. So I'll take some synthetic grease. I'm running it on the teeth at the bottom of the cocking rack and on the cocking teeth on the top edge of the cocking rack, and I'm running some underneath. Drop this into place. Put our bush back in there. I think that's correct. We'll find out in a minute. Getting the position of this correct is a bit interesting sometimes. This gear at the top, I think it's got 21 teeth. Well, 21's a nice odd number. Can go on in any one of 4 positions because it's got a square hole in the middle. That inevitably means that if it's in one position, the rack will be further this way slightly or further back the other way slightly. And sometimes that can make a difference. So we'll see how we go today. I'm going to hold that rack down with my finger, hold down the lock lever, see if it completes the stroke smoothly. It appeared to, so I'm going to say that's good. Now I'm going to pop this strap lug on at this end of the camera at the moment, just because it'll hold the chrome trim in place, and make life a little bit less awkward. That's good. We'll say that that's good. Put the strap lug on at this end. Now the screw that goes down here, excuse me. Alright, let's get this strap lug in place. Now the screw that goes through the bush is a special one. It's got a plain area on it that runs through that bush and locates it positively, and I'm just going to put a smear of molybdenum on that piece there. And put the screw in here. I'm just going to check the action again. I've got a clamp down plate that goes on here to a guide. I just want to check the action again. Make sure it completes the stroke smoothly and easily, and it does. That's just ideal. So this little clamp goes on there. That's got a little bearing on it. And of course this has been through the cleaner, so any lubricant it had has been pushed out. So I've just forced a little bit of grease in there. This is held in with 2 screws. And one here. And again, I'll check the action of that rack, make sure it all moves smoothly, and it does. That's good. So, I think the rewind post could probably go back in there now. And after that we start getting into more exciting stuff. I'll just put a smear of grease in the rewind shaft bush. Yeah, that's free enough, that's good. Pop that on the body. It's held in place with 2 screws. Check they're nice and tight, that's good. This post goes in here. It's a support post for the top cover really, that just goes in there. Okay, next I need to just check and make sure that put a bit of molybdenum paste on these posts down here that these arms run on. Fit the spring at this point In fact, actually I might fit that later because that's easily damaged and easily lost. We've got to fit the exposure meter, which means running the cord, putting the exposure meter in place, things of that nature. While I've got it at this stage, I'm going to put a touch of lacquer on the screw at the top here to make sure that can't work loose. I'm going to start putting the exposure meter in place now. It's always a bit entertaining trying to get this done. So I'll start off, I'm just going to lubricate this hole here where the shutter release goes down, and find my shutter release and the film release button. Now there are two springs here. The long spring goes on the film release. The short spring goes on the shutter release. Just give that a little wipe with molybdenum there, where that runs against that post. That's good. Put a smear of molybdenum in the film release button where that runs on the shaft. That's good. The exposure meter, it sits on here. Now I'm going to take this opportunity to put a little bit of grease on the top of that take-up spool there, the film advance shaft, just so it gets into that teeth of the cocking rack, and drop that meter into place. It should just hook on and drop into place pretty much. That's better. That's clicked into place. That's just sitting there. There's nothing holds that meter on, unfortunately. That's why it's a bit awkward doing this job, because the flaming thing will fall off every 5 seconds while you're trying to work. So we've got our meter cord. Now this is the original cord here. I think it's made of braided silk. They're very, very strong. If they're not broken, or I check them very carefully. If there's no damaged parts on the cord, then it's fit for reuse typically, and certainly that's the case with this. So there is a plan to how this thing is fitted, and if you're doing this job, you're best to consult the manual, because you certainly don't want to be getting it wound round the wrong way or on the wrong pulley, because otherwise what will happen is that you will find that the meter runs in the wrong direction. That's a very disconcerting thing, I can tell you. I'm just checking my movement here, bottom to the front. Okay. Now I've got to pull the cord through. So I've got a little piece of wire here shaped to do that job. This allows me to pull those things down through the hole where I can get at them. That looks good. I'll just even those up a little bit and check that I've got my cord running where I want the cord to run. Make sure it's running around that drum correctly. It's not crossed over or tucked up or anything. It is. That's better. So I've got my cord running correctly there. Making sure that's all parallel. Things are where I want them to be. I'm going to clamp them loosely in place at this point, and to do that I'm using 2 washers and a screw. and it's just so that I can keep track of which piece goes where, which of the cords I'm looking at, the front one or the back one, because now we've got to get them around another pulley and then onto the drum. Let's tighten that screw down loosely. Now I'm going to choose to take my front cord over to towards the end of the camera. I'll just tighten that down loosely on that cord, because if you do that screw up tight, of course you will cut the cord, which would be a bother and a nuisance. So the meter's sitting there, everything else is in place. At the top, that's all good. It's not fixed to the drum at the top, it's not hooked in, that cord. I'm going to put on the shutter release button, and I'm going to put a top cover in place to hold that in there so that meter can't get lost or can't fall off. And I've got an old top cover here, which is somewhat unhappy looking, but it's made to do this job. It's been adjusted so that I can fit meters and have them held in place smoothly while I'm working. I'll get that screw in there to hold it. I'll put a screw down at the other end for good measure. There's the one that came from there. That's chrome plated. Alright, so now I'm happy that my meter is not going to fall off and cause me grief. I can think about getting the drum ready and then start getting this all in place. This is all a bit tricky, this. Getting it right the first time is something that's you strive for, but you don't necessarily succeed. So I'll just put a little bit of synthetic grease in the centre of that drum so that it rolls smoothly. That's fine. It certainly doesn't need anything excessive there. I'm just checking which cord I'm looking at here, because of course I can't really see with that top cover on, so that might not have been the smartest move. Alright. This was our front cord, this was the rear cord, and I'm looking at my winding pattern. The front cord should be the shorter of the two, and fortunately for us it is. That runs to the bottom. And the rear cord runs to the top. Something like that. If I get these in place, that on the shaft, that looks just about appropriate. Right, I'm going back now. I'm going to take that screw out. I think we can remove our screw and washers. And I'll check the run of that cord, see if I've managed to do that without getting things crossed over. I have got that correct, but I've got a twist in the cable, so they're running across each other. I can't have that because that will cause me grief. Let's see if I can untwist that. Front one to the bottom, back one to the top. Just checking the alignment there, making sure I've got that right, that they are not crossed over. Two of them are running on the same pulley at this point. That looks good. I'm just going to check the position of things now. That meter should start in about that position. Alright, the cord's a bit crossed over each other at the moment on the drum, so I've got to see if I can untangle that. Yeah, that looks almost right. You want a smooth cable run here, you don't want cord tangled behind itself. That's better. Right. That should be our start position about there. In an ideal world, this cord would run on nice and parallel as it runs onto the drum. Of course, we don't live in an ideal world, so that may or may not happen. Yeah, that should really be coming across there. Let's see if I can push that one back a bit. That's good. That's running nice and smoothly. That's where it should be at the start position, which is roughly here. Of course, our drum is not connected. At the top here, the cord runs round it, but it's not hooked on. That's in place. I'll put my shutter release button back on there. And I'm going to put a short top section on here just to keep that meter from getting away. Again, that's another section that was stolen from something. It was either a Retina Reflex S or possibly a Retina 3S rangefinder camera, which uses the same basic body as this, and that just keeps everything in place there. That's good, that part's good. I can pop that to one side. Next thing I've got to do here is get the transfer shaft and cam all back in place, and we need to put a bracket on here to hold the spring on that, because that spring has to be preloaded with quite a bit of tension, and it's not easy to get that correct, but we need to get that in place. So that's my next task.